Hey, Josh.
Hello,
Welcome, welcome. Glad you're with us.
glad to be here.
Good. Do you have slides? Did you send any slides to
I
share?
have slides. I can share my screen.
Okay, so Sherry will take care of that. She's our host.
You can share, Josh.
Yeah. Just let me know when you would like me to begin.
Yeah, let's wait till 2 because people come on sometimes just for this. So, or maybe
how many are on now?
27. We have a little bet going in this house how many people are going to come on. I'm
What's the
hoping
over-under?
I'm hoping a lot more so I can win the bet. But we have a great group. We just had a really good discussion. Affinity groups, good questions. So were you on for any of that, Josh?
Just the tail end.
Yep. Do you know Jared Moffat, who's working with Graham? He's leading the charge here in Massachusetts on the ballot initiative.
Oh, cool. I know Graham, but I don't think I've met Jared.
Okay. Oh, it's 2 o'clock. So I think we can get started. Great. Well, I have a little intro to introduce you, Josh, which I took off of the Fireside Project's website, which is a great website. I recommend that everyone look at it. It's got a lot of really good information on it. So Josh is the founder of the Fireside Project. He's a lawyer, a risk reduction activist, and an aspiring psychedelic researcher. I would take aspiring out of that, quite frankly. You probably wrote that before you were a published psychedelic researcher. Now you are, so you can tell us about that article. We're looking forward to that. He believes in the power of peer support and the role of support lines as foundational components of an equitable mental health ecosystem. Prior to founding the Fireside Project, Joshua volunteered for many years as a counselor on Safe and Sound's Talk Line and a psychedelic peer support provider for the Zendo Project. Before devoting his life to the psychedelic field, Joshua spent more than a decade as a deputy city attorney at the San Francisco City Attorney's Office, where he focused on suing businesses exploiting vulnerable communities, serving as general counsel to city departments, and co-teaching a nationally renowned clinic at the Yale Law School. He also clerked on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and practiced civil litigation at Conrad, Metlinsky, and Kane. So thank you so much, Josh, for giving us your time. And I'll introduce you if you wonder who this man is next to me. This is my husband,
Hi, Josh. Thanks for being here.
Who is also an attorney. So I suspect we'll have some good questions for you at some point. So everyone knows you as well, Josh. We weren't sure when we spoke. Rick Doblin is able to join us. He usually aims to get here around 3. You have till 3:15 if we have questions going, but just so you know, we do have Rick coming on.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Anne, for the introduction, and it's really an honor to be with you all today. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Are you able to see it?
Yep, looks good.
Oh, great. So the presentation that I'll give today is called Peer Support is Psychedelic, the Role of Peer Support in the Psychedelic Ecosystem. I hope to talk for 30 to 35 minutes and leave a ton of opportunity for questions at the end, which you can just ask audibly or by putting a message in the box. I hope to cover 3 topics today. The first is just kind of giving an overview of the psychedelic peer support line. What is it? Who volunteers on it? What is the training that we provide? And how do we think about the role of the support line in the field? The second topic is how we understand and practice peer support at Fireside Project. I think if you ask 10 people what peer support is, you'll probably get 10 different answers. And so I think it's important to really give an overview of why we think peer support is so significant for multiple reasons. And then finally, and as you alluded to, I'll talk about Fireside Project's harm reduction study that we just published last month with colleagues at Mount Sinai and UCSF. So first, a bit about Fireside Project and the psychedelic peer support line. Our 4 focuses at Fireside Project are culturally attuned peer support, peer-reviewed research, public education, and the creation of a more equitable psychedelic field. And I think the part of the beauty of Fireside Project is that by operating a psychedelic peer support line, we can really work towards accomplishing all 4 of those focus areas. And so really the core premise of what we do at Fireside Project, or the core, I guess, hypothesis, is that a helpline staffed by volunteers trained in the principles of peer support can help people minimize the risks and fulfill the potential of their psychedelic experiences while serving as a training ground for aspiring practitioners and a platform for world-class research. We launched the psychedelic peer support line back in April 2021. And so we've been operating it for just about 2.5 years. So what is the scope of what we do on the psychedelic peer support line? Well, by phone, text message, and mobile app, we support 3 groups of people. People who are processing past psychedelic experiences. So this is free integration support, whether the underlying trip happened days or decades ago. And we really do get people from the full range of that range, really lifting up for me the idea that integration is the work of a lifetime. The second is we support people who are actually tripping. Now, you may wonder, how is someone who is tripping able to operate a phone? Some may not be able to, but we created what we think is the first app that's specifically designed for people in the midst of psychedelic experiences. There's a photo of it on the screen here. And when you open up the app, you see 2 floating orange buttons, one that says call and one that says text. And we tried to make it as easy to operate as possible. And then finally, we support trip sitters. In other words, people who are supporting someone else who's having a psychedelic experience. Notice that we do not support people before psychedelic experiences. And that's not because we think that integration or preparation isn't important, but rather because for legal reasons, we want to remove a concern that we are encouraging people to engage in what is still in many places and under federal law, illegal conduct. So who actually takes calls on the psychedelic peer support line? Well, we have a really rigorous process for hiring volunteers. We think this is one of the most impactful volunteer experiences that a person can have in the psychedelic field. We accept about 1 in 5 applicants who go through a pretty rigorous interview and written application process. We then have about a 50-hour foundational skills training. That's a mix of presentations, demonstrations, and then dyads. And really that 50-hour training is kind of the start of the community building process, which lasts a full year or more at Fireside Project. We ask all volunteers to commit to 1 year of service with us, which is pretty standard for support lines. And that's really because there's a learning curve to working on the support line. Everything from learning how to operate our software system to what our protocols are, including our emergency services protocol, as well as just really getting comfortable with the art of active listening and providing peer support. So people volunteer for 4 hours a week for a full year. So we have 3 shifts per day, 4 hours each, and people volunteer on the same shift for a full year. And each shift is kind of a mini community where people can learn together, learn from each other, provide feedback to each other, and really get detailed feedback from paid supervisors who are on each shift. And each supervisor is typically a clinician or a facilitator. And we think this is really a springboard to a career in psychedelics. As I like to say, one of the best ways to learn how to provide psychedelic support is to actually provide psychedelic support and to receive detailed feedback from people who have a lot of experience doing so. That's how people learn in other professions, whether it's psychology or trial practice. And we think it's particularly true here at Fireside Project. So we've had about 18,000 conversations in the 2.5 years that we've been operating. And as you can see from this, our call volume has more or less steadily been increasing. We've been doing a kind of series of experiments to see what works in getting the word out about Fireside Project. And there are really no magic bullets, with one exception, which is TikTok. TikTok is the single best driver of call volume at Fireside. In-person outreach doesn't really work. We've had presence at festivals. Instagram is helpful. Google AdWords is helpful, but a viral TikTok video drives call volume like no other. We had a viral video that was still incomprehensible to me several months ago, and we had close to 100 calls on a Tuesday afternoon, which was more than double what we had on New Year's last year. So TikTok is a platform that is difficult to understate when it comes to psychedelics. So here's kind of how those 18,000 calls have been divided up. About 1/3 of our callers are tripping, about 1/3 are integrating, about 12% are just seeking information about psychedelics, and that's a really important function that we think we can serve. You know, someone's looking for an integration coach, or they're looking to learn more information about substances, we can refer them to Arrowhead or psychedelic.support or other websites. Trip sitting calls are about 5%, and we have just under 2% of our callers are microdosing. I should say the validity of many of our statistics is limited by the fact that our call logs are filled out by volunteers, and so sometimes there's some license, I suppose you could say, in deciding, for example, if someone took a microdose but it was actually a macrodose, is that indicated as microdosing or tripping? But generally, this should give you a picture. I should also say that we collect data currently from 2 sources. One is call logs, as I mentioned, filled out by our volunteers. And then the second is post-call surveys. But as I'll talk about at the end, we have just deployed our new software system that will really supercharge our research and training ability. For people who are tripping, the average call length for phone is 38 minutes, and for text is 57 minutes, and roughly similar for integration. For integration calls, we have a 45-minute limit for phone calls, and we don't have a limit for tripping calls. And here you can see the substances that people have consumed when they've reached out to Fireside Project. And again, this is limited by the fact that our volunteers don't always ask every single question under the sun, but rather only those questions that directly serve the building of the rapport and connection. So you can see psilocybin is 52%, roughly 51.3% of our calls. I don't think that is because psilocybin necessarily has a higher risk profile, but rather because it's just the most widely available and cheapest often. So about 20% LSD, 5% ketamine, 4% MDMA, and so forth. And a lot of this data, or I should say all of this data, we can break, and much more that I'm not showing, we can break down across different metrics. So if you wanted to know, for example, of the 55 or 51% of psilocybin callers, how many of them were calling during or after a psilocybin experience. And then there's a whole series of harm reduction data that I'll be sharing later that can also be broken down across multiple different metrics, which makes our research, I think, capability particular. Oh, can you still see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So next, I just wanted to really talk about how we understand and practice peer support at Fireside Project. Because as I said, if you ask people about peer support, there'll be many, many different definitions and understandings of it. At Fireside Project, we have adopted a conception of peer support that is broad and deep. And that conception is really necessitated by the nature of the psychedelic experience itself. As we know, the psychedelic experience is vast, as well as the integration of psychedelic experiences. And so that requires a container that is equally vast and sophisticated, one that includes a set of tools, as well as a set of boundaries and limits that's up to the task. And it also demands importing the rigor and depth of clinical support into a peer support context. And the fact that we do that, I think, is one of the reasons why spending time as a peer supporter at Fireside makes you a better clinician. So then what is peer support? The essence of peerness is withness. One of the things that's interesting when I share that is often people will say, did you say witness or withness? And the proximity of those two words to each other and the meaning of those two words, I think is really beautiful and is part of the essence of peer support, that an aspect of being with is to witness someone's experience. At the core of peer support is the idea that each person is their own healer. Our role as peers is to be with our callers, to walk alongside of them on their unique healing path, and to empower them to connect with their own agency and their own truth. We really honor our callers' autonomy. And if you're thinking to yourself, wow, that sounds really similar to how MAPS teaches MDMA-assisted psychotherapists. Yes, that is true. And I think that really speaks to the role that peer support can play and how similar in many contexts it is to clinical support. As peers, we bear witness to the full depth and range of human emotion. We witness pain and suffering, joy and confusion. We're simply with our callers, human to human. And as Ram Dass said, in the context of supporting people in the dying process, we are a loving rock.
Josh, sorry to interrupt, but what we're seeing is substances consumed. Is that what you want us to be seeing?
No, I'm sorry. Let me reshare.
Thank you, and I'm pointing that out.
Oh, okay.
We got stuck on substances consumed.
Okay, let me
We're
try it again.
Josh, we're with you.
Let me try one more time. Okay. Let me try. Okay. I think I've got it figured out. All right.
Good. Great.
Yes, the essence of pureness is withness. And yes, as I said, so as Ram Dass said, providing peer support is a lot like supporting someone through the dying process, including the idea of being a loving rock. And peer support is about using our own lived experience to support someone else navigating a similar lived experience. One of the things that's so fascinating about psychedelic peer support is that it is a fundamental shift in how peer support is practiced in other contexts, where the layer of peerness is often pathology-based. Someone who has depression is supporting a person who is also navigating depression, and so forth. Whereas psychedelic peer support, the layer of peerness that matters is the fact that you've had a psychedelic experience, regardless of any kind of underlying disorder. So why is peer support so important? One is harm reduction. That being on the phone and having the peer supporter create a safe, non-judgmental space for you to have your psychedelic experience is actually reduces harms, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But you notice there are three other aspects of why peer support is important. And I always bristle when people say Fireside Project is a harm reduction service. Harm reduction is one consequence of the work that we do, the safe container that we create at Fireside Project. But there are other consequences as well. One of them is meaning making. Without the psychedelic container, there isn't really a foundation for making meaning in relationship with another human being. Meaning making is essential to being alive. It's a core human need. And especially after a psychedelic experience, the absence of a container to process that experience can create distress and can actually be harmful. And other reasons that peer support is so important is spiritual growth and development and the alleviation of alienation and anxiety and isolation. And I should also say that that some of that alienation and isolation can occur when a patient talks to a clinician who is not familiar with psychedelics, or who the patient doesn't sufficiently trust to really go into the depth of their psychedelic experiences. I think that's a really important point. It's not just about whether the clinician knows about psychedelics, it's about whether there's enough trust that the patient has in the clinician to really be able to share in a fulsome way. And finally, equitable access is another reason that peer support is so important. Not everyone has the means to pay out of pocket for therapy or has mental health care coverage that includes psychotherapy. Nor do many people want to speak to a psychotherapist about their psychedelic experiences. They would prefer a peer. So how do we practice peer support at Fireside Project? We create a boundaried container for our callers. We put the caller first. Peer support at Fireside Project is not like, talking to a friend necessarily, or talking to a stranger on a bus. Everything that we do is in service of the caller and their needs. Sometimes a caller's worldview, political beliefs, spiritual and religious beliefs, and ways of being may be radically different from our own. And that's normal, and that's okay. And one thing that we really focus on at Fireside Project, and one way that we remain so caller-centered, is to really cultivate the awareness that the way callers treat us is fundamentally not about us. Each person, especially those in the midst of psychedelic experiences, of course, enters the conversation with their own past experiences. And the way that they're acting is likely a product of those experiences and not who we are. We also maintain unconditional positive regard, and we actively listen. I like to think of active listening as like the bridge between two souls. It's how we cultivate connection. One of the most, I think, fascinating parts about active listening which often revolves reflecting back what we're hearing, what we're seeing, the meanings that we're noticing, is that our ability to hold space for a particular emotion that a caller may be experiencing is a direct function of our own understanding of that emotion and our own comfort with that emotion. If I'm not comfortable with anger and a caller is presenting with a lot of anger, I may try to move the caller away from that emotion or suggest to the caller, even subtly, that anger is not okay. And I think that's a beautiful fact because it really invites us to do our own inner work. How else do we practice peer support at Fireside? We validate and normalize. We cultivate awareness of transference and countertransference, and we engage in self-disclosure only for the purpose of building connection, which often can just mean saying, yeah, I've had some intense trips too, and I know it's hard. That can build connection. Going into depth about my own trips may not. One final thing about transference and countertransference is, I've had clinicians say to me, well, transference and countertransference, these are really like concepts from psychotherapy. And my response is, sorry, but those are facts of human relationships. If a caller reminds me of my mother, and I don't know that the caller reminds me of my mother, and I start treating the caller like I would treat my mother, that could be a real problem in the conversation with the caller. So I think all of this is to say that, and I hope all of this really lifts up the idea that the time that one spends at Fireside cultivating these skills and cultivating this awareness makes you a better clinician. And then finally, with regard to how we practice peer support, we are trauma informed. That's an aspect of our training that continues from the initial training all the way to the end. And we also provide culturally attuned care that is rooted in humility and curiosity. So that's kind of my overview of how we practice peer support at Fireside Project. It's in depth, it's rigorous, it borrows from clinical practice, and we think it's what our callers deserve, and we think it's why time at Fireside is such a potent tool for going on to other careers in psychedelic support. Some misconceptions about Fireside Project. One of them I touched on, that we're only a harm reduction service, but harm reduction is actually a consequence of creating a safe and non-judgmental container. It's not the sole end. I've heard people say that the psychedelic peer support line is for people who don't have access to clinical support. Well, 30% of our callers have a clinician who they talk to. So then why are they reaching out to Fireside Project? Well, it's a range of reasons. One is, what do you do on Monday when you've had a big trip on Friday and your next session with your therapist isn't for several days? You can call Fireside Project. Obviously, also, you're not going to actually be tripping when you're with your therapist unless you're in a psychedelic therapy session. But also, we have a lot of people really tell us that they don't feel comfortable talking really in depth about material that they encountered during their psychedelic experience that doesn't fit within Western psychology paradigms. There are indigenous ways of knowing that psychedelic experiences can evoke, transpersonal ways of knowing, non-human centered ways of knowing. And all of those, I think, like aspects of existence and and encountering those types of experiences can make someone feel really uncomfortable about speaking to a Western trained psychologist. And I think the final thing, the support we provide shares little in common with therapy. I think it should be clear by now. So now that I've talked about how we practice peer support at Fireside Project, I'll talk a little bit about the study that was just published in June, co-authored with Molly Pleat at Oregon Health Sciences University, Joseph Zamaria at UCSF, and one of my personal heroes, Rachel Yehuda from Mount Sinai. And the study is called Reducing the Harms of Non-Clinical Psychedelics Use Through a Peer Support Telephone Helpline. And so we started from a couple of premises. One premise is that in other contexts, helplines work. They are a high impact, low cost way to, oops, there's a typo there, to reduce harms and interactions with emergency services. Another premise is that peer support works in other aspects of the mental health ecosystem. So if we apply peer support in a new context and hotlines in a new context, are there similar results? So yes, is the answer based on the data that we gathered, which is preliminary data. But this data is based on about 800 conversations, our first 800 conversations, and 12.5% indicated, and by the way, this all comes from post-call surveys filled out after we send the surveys a day after the conversation. 12.5% said that but for their conversation with a peer support specialist, they may have called 911. 10.8% said they may have gone to the ER, and 29.3% indicated that they may have been physically or emotionally harmed. And those percentages have generally held across our first 8,000 or 18,000 calls. Now, here's another really interesting finding from the study, which is basically that there is harm that can occur if a person doesn't have support during their integration process. So 66.4% indicated that their conversation de-escalated them from distress. 23% said they may have been physically or emotionally harmed but for their call. And then statistics about 911 in the emergency room. So this is literally from the integration process. So of course, integration is not just the icing on the cake. It's an essential part of meaning making and healing, and the absence of integration support can potentially be risky. And I think one of the really big challenges that we face as a field is how do we talk to people who are new to psychedelics about what integration actually is, why it matters, and what the tools for integration actually are. Because so often the paradigm that people have is, you have a problem like a headache, you take an aspirin, and the headache goes away. You don't integrate the experience of taking aspirin. So how do we speak to people about integration? So de-escalating callers and emotional, mental, or physical distress. So 65.9% of our callers reached out to us in a state of psychological distress. Now, that's not to say, of course, that we are a bad trip hotline, and the only reason people reach out to us is when they're in distress. 24% of our callers were not in distress when they reached out to us, and we've really been trying to push the narrative that we're here not just when you're in distress, but just when you're seeking support and connection and understanding. This is a particularly, I think, fascinating graph that comes from the article. So 27% of our callers who contacted us to discuss current or past trips, 27.4% mentioned an underlying psychiatric condition. PTSD, major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and others. So of course, people are consuming media about the benefits of psychedelics, psychedelics are not available yet clinically, with the exception of ketamine, obviously. And so people are self-medicating now. And many of them are calling Fireside. The study does have some very significant limitations that I want to be upfront about. Of course, callers are self-selecting. We had a fairly low response rate. Our peer supporters only ask questions that are in service of building connection. We didn't get a lot of response where people kind of provided explanations about their experiences with Fireside Project. And our call log system and our survey system used to be separate systems that did not communicate with each other. But that's actually a pretty good segue into where is Fireside Project headed? And this is my second to last slide. So where is Fireside Project going? If you look at other national support lines, whether it's Military Veterans Crisis Line, Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 1 million calls a year is kind of where is fairly typical. It's even on the low end for certain services like 988. But I think we'll get there. 2/3 of American adults have said that they'd be open to trying psychedelics if psychedelics are shown to be safe. And so if that's true, I think we can expect the need for Fireside Project and our support line to continue to increase. And that's not just for harm reduction, but also for the other reasons that I described, the making of meaning, spiritual growth and development, as well as equitable access. I know this is a research group that I'm talking to, and so I'm really excited to share about our new software system called FirePad that we built over the last 2 years with research and training in mind. So we have the ability to send customized longitudinal post-call surveys based on the content of the call, right? So let's say that a volunteer checks a box and said, oh, I'm talking to a military veteran. That may be a series of questions that that person gets that may be different from a non-veteran. And the ability to send automated longitudinal surveys is, I think, really significant. In other words, for people who opt in, sending surveys at 1 month, 6 months, in a year, or other agreed upon timelines. And so one of the questions that we hope to be exploring is a study for which we're currently seeking funding with the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences group, Jules Evans and Ollie Robinson. And we're really wanting to answer the question of, or help try to answer the question of, when a person has a challenging psychedelic experience, why are some people able to really alchemize that and make positive life change? And why are others less able to do so? I think actually being able to send surveys to people who had a challenging psychedelic experience and then follow up with them at a regular interval could be a really powerful way to do that. Next is we're exploring the idea of transcribing and anonymizing conversations, and then using natural language processing to learn about the content of the material. So the idea for this came from a talk that I saw Rachel Yehuda give, where basically she and one of her grad students, Lauren Lepeau, had conversations with military veterans before and after their MDMA experiences. And natural language processing is can be a very subtle way of determining how emotions changed over time. Well, we think we'll be able to do that very soon as we can really nail down the anonymization technology and really do NLP on a much broader scale. And then the final thing when we talk about looking forward at Fireside Project is expanding our practitioner training. One of the best ways to learn, of course, isn't just to provide psychedelic support, but it's to be able to get nuanced and tailored feedback. The new system will allow us to record, anonymize, and obfuscate conversations so that our students, our volunteers can have one-on-one conversations with supervisors where they walk through their calls, as well as discuss calls at weekly case conferences. So that's where we're headed. And if you're interested in staying in touch, here's my email address. And I would love to do my best to answer all of your questions.
Wow, Josh, fabulous. Thank you, thank you. Such broad, wonderful support you're giving to so many people. It's great. So, as you said, it's time for questions. Anyone here? You can raise your hand or put it in the chat. Sure, if no one else. So I do have a question right next to me, so we can start with that. And then I see Rebecca, you have your hand raised. Thank you.
Josh, it's Ship and Page speaking. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I just admire the work that you're doing. This has to do with intuition and the sense of being with somebody in an experience. A lot of it has to do with reading body language and not necessarily taking in verbal cues, but seeking energy. And I know that obviously visuals are very, very complicated, but how do you deal with that sense of getting to the underlying issues that the person's words may not necessarily signify?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think with any, form of support that's provided, there are going to be pros and cons, like strengths and weaknesses. Certainly not being in the same physical location as someone really does deprive you of the ability to look at physical cues. There's just no way around that. And I think that phones are everywhere, that there's cell phone reception, so you have this broader access, of course. But I actually have been stunned by just how nuanced one can get just by hearing someone's voice. I volunteered for 7 years on a prior support line, and it almost, when there's only one sense to pick up on, which is the sound of the person's voice and the pauses that they're making, maybe even their breathing, it is stunning how nuanced one can get. And there may be cues that you don't get, of course, and that's where there can be an opportunity for thoughtfully asked questions. I'm wondering, how do you feel in your body right now? And so what you can't see, you can often make up for by really tuning in and asking good questions.
Thank you so much. It's just an intriguing field. So thank you very much for the work you're doing.
Maybe you could do a research study where you have FaceTime compared to just talking, peer support, and see if there's any difference.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. And I think, we've thought about the idea of like integration circles, which we would obviously do by Zoom. I think I worry a little bit with volunteers and Zoom, especially when someone's tripping. I think there are I think the potential for boundary challenges goes way up, and confidentiality is really part of the core container that we create, and it's much easier to create that and hold boundaries when it's voice only. But I think you're totally right that would be a fascinating study, and
maybe you could give people the option. I'm not sure they could make the decision, but that would be interesting. But I get the anonymity part would be complicated.
Yeah.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Yeah, I love the work that you do, and I love the peer support that you have, target groups. We know Will from the veterans group, so the fact that you have peers on the other line who are veterans, that I think that's such an amazing service to hit on those nuanced peer-to-peer scenarios. I wanted to ask about your selection. When you said 1 in 5 people are selected, I'm curious the range of folks who apply, and then what are your differentiating factors for the people who are selected?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And ultimately, it boils down to, would I want this person supporting me or the person I love most in the world? And sometimes the number of the number of letters that a person has after their name can kind of cut against them. I think sometimes like we look for this kind of like we look for like, does this person seem like they want to fix, or do they seem able to stay in a humble space that honors the caller's autonomy? And I think for some clinicians, depending on their orientation, like that can be a little harder. And I think like learning what we've heard from volunteers who are clinicians, which is it's got to be over 50%, although I don't have the numbers in front of me, that learning to flex that muscle of not trying to fix and really honoring the caller's like inner healer, if you will, is a muscle worth like flexing and cultivating. And I think some of the most powerful moments come after a call when we're talking to a clinician who has just provided peer support, and they were like, in that moment, I saw where, you know, clinical support and peer support might diverge, but then also where the areas where that Venn diagram overlaps are actually, I think, like more significant than maybe like initially obvious.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. And also, of course, things like, you know, does the person have prior experience, whether it's at the Zendo project, PsyCare, other in-person psychedelic peer support, or non-psychedelic peer support. Yeah, a whole host of things like that too. Yeah, Patricia.
Thanks, Josh, for your presentation. And actually, I have a question, which I think comes from the same slide Rebecca had a question on, and that actually is the time commitment. So I noticed 50 hours of training, which is wonderful, but then 4 hours per week for 1 year. And you know, I myself, for example, you know, don't necessarily have that, you know, ability to be exact same 4 hours, you know, 52 weeks in a row. Is there any flexibility there?
Yes. So we do have people who regularly change their shifts, and we have a fantastic scheduling software that we use called Connect Team, where it's very easy and fully automated to basically swap a shift. So let's say you can't do your Thursday shift, you indicate that in Connect Team, and then others are notified that Patricia's shift is now open, and they can pick it up, and then you can pick up another one. Where we don't have flexibility is on the 1 year commitment. And that's because it's such an expenditure of time and resources for us to train someone. And it really kind of does, in my experience, like take, you know, at least 6 months to kind of get the hang of it. Like, what is peer support and how do we practice it? How do you operate our software system? And then also just our protocols, like everything from what is the scope of the line, what do we consider to be a psychedelic, and how do we really like actively listen and ask questions and so forth. But it's a big time commitment, and it's a major limiting factor in working with us.
Thank you.
I have a question if no one else does at this point. I wondered if you could elaborate on your or expand on your expanded practitioner training that you put at the end of the slide. It sounds like such a great fertile ground for training. So how do you hope to change that or move on with that?
Yeah, so we're kind of in the midst of this process of really exploring that question. And you know, we're Fireside Project is a nonprofit. To date, you know, all of our support has been philanthropic. and we need revenue streams. There was a period of many years, or many, like 1 to 2 years, where we would get calls from training programs about their students doing practicums at Fireside Project. And I was like, yes, absolutely. What will you pay us? And 100% of the responses were, oh, no, 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 we wouldn't pay you. We would give you the opportunity to have our students work on your support line. So we are exploring the possibility of, offering a service where people would pay to spend time at Fireside, providing peer support, learning substantive components, and all of which are really rooted in our calls. So, like, as I said, we're, likely going to be starting to record, anonymize, and obfuscate conversations. And so that will give us, within a month, a vast library of conversations that can be used as didactic tools. And so I think there's a real pathway here for us to make that transition, incorporate BPMT standards when those are promulgated, and really become like the premier experiential practitioner training program. And I do think that we can do that because of the way that we understand and teach and practice peer support. I think like one of the kind of like questions we get is, well, it's peer support. How is that helpful if I'm a clinician? And I think like, spending a year cultivating awareness of your own countertransference, interacting with people who are tripping and integrating, cultivating your active listening skills, as well as learning, substantive knowledge that's based in actual calls, I think could be really valuable. For example, if you're, wanting to do an experiential, or sorry, a substantive component on 5-MeO DMT integration, what better way to learn that than to actually hear 5-MeO DMT integration challenges, and then be able to see how different people approach them and so forth.
Fabulous. No, that's really exciting. It'll be fun to see where it all goes. Thank you. Penelope. Yeah.
Can I jump? Oh, sorry, someone else jumping in.
Okay.
Josh, thank you so much for what you're doing. I think it's a wonderful service and really good experience for people. I have a couple questions. What about the age of callers? Do you have any sense of that? And I'm really curious about the TikTok connection. A lot of the early younger generations really use text, phones, etc., for intimate things like this. And what about repetitive callers? Do you know much about that?
Yeah, so all great questions. We do keep track of the age of the caller if they share it with us, right? So we don't ask every caller, how old are you? But if they mention their age or kind of information that would allow us to glean their age, like they're a freshman in college, for instance, we would note that. And so our biggest age group is 23 to 30. Second is 18 to 22. Third is 31 to 40, and then it kind of like bell curves out. We do get callers who are under 18, and we do support them as well. Unless the caller were like extremely young, we haven't had, I think maybe 14 is the youngest caller that we've had, but our insurance allows us to, support people of any age. And then, TikTok, like so many things that we have done, like, it was just an experiment, right? One day, about a year and a half ago, our call volume on a random night just spiked. And it turned out that this TikTok influencer had sung a song about Fireside Project. And so we started asking the callers, why are you calling today? Basically, because there were so many calls. And then we learned about TikTok. And then we recently hired a TikTok ambassador who's, 25, and she's amazing. And you just have to try different things. I mean, TikTok is very different from, I can't believe I'm actually speaking about TikTok because I don't warrant to actually use the app. But, like the algorithm is very temperamental, and so you know it's hard because it's not like Instagram where if you just pay money for boosts you'll just get more views. TikTok works differently, and so it's important to try to like learn as much as you can about it. And I actually kind of think like across the field it's like an under discussed like pathway in to connecting with people about psychedelics, like teaching about psychedelics and harm reduction and so forth.
And repetition?
Oh, right, and repetition. Yeah, so on the software system the systems that we've been using the past 2.5 years, we did not have that ability unless someone just affirmatively told us that they were a repeat caller. Now, as of like a month ago, we have this new system where we, you know, even though we don't save phone numbers, the system notes whether like the person's a repeat caller. I don't have statistics, but I think it's like 10 to 15%, but I'm not sure. I really I'm just estimating. But that is important information. And I should also say we do like invite people to call back at the end of every call. And so I think that kind of like longitudinal integration support, even though it's not necessarily going to be with the same peer supporter, is important.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Dana.
Is it my turn? I just have to say I just think you're a rock star, and I'm like so happy to know you, and it's like a privilege and joy to see all the progress these last couple of years, and hope to see you afloat later still. And Mary Cosimano said to say hi, and she was sorry that she couldn't be here. So I know you've met Jeannie Fontana of Treat. I just keep thinking about funding for you because it's just such an incredible service. And when Jared presented, I was thinking about similar things because you guys take callers from everywhere. And I remember your talk with Hanifa at Horizons in Portland and how underutilized peer support is. And so as these initiatives come at the state level, I just keep thinking about funding for you because of the cost effectiveness of keeping people out of the ER and all of these things. So anyway, that was sort of one question, a pinpoint of like how that's coming. And then the next was, I know you'd been working on scholarships for groups of people who you hope to have provide those services. And I was wondering about an update on that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, integrating into the ecosystem of states that are like changing the legal status of psychedelics is definitely a priority. You know, we haven't been like written into, you know, any of the regulations yet, but it's like a priority to make sure that, for example, in Oregon, all facilitators and training centers know about us, right? Like it's free integration support. So it's a priority, and it's also really time consuming. And you know, unfortunately, I would love it if we were like, you know, written into the regulations in some fashion, like, you know, providers have to just have our number and up in their center and provide it to patients or things like that. But yeah, I mean, the reason that we did the study that I talked about is because we want public funding. You know, as a former government lawyer, I kind of had the sense that the way that you try to get government funding is convince the government that you'll save it money. And
Exactly.
I think reducing ER visits kind of does that. So yeah, it's a process, and it's a slow process. Like I was lucky enough to go back to SAMHSA last month or 2 months ago, and you know, talk about psychedelics and harm reduction. And so along with folks from the Zendo and Dance Safe and others, and there seems to be there's definitely interest in SAMHSA and the psychedelic field. Like whether that actually translates into grants, I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah,
You have such valuable data. I'm thinking about Elliot Marseille, who came to one of my houseboat things, and he's like psychedelic economist at Berkeley. And there are people who specialize in like, if you spend this, you could save this at the state level. So anyway, I'm gonna keep noodling. We'll talk more about it.
Great.
Oh, and the scholarship thing.
Oh yeah, right. You know, the psychedelic philanthropy field is struggling, as are so many philanthropic sectors. And so we just have to prioritize trying to keep the lights on. And so we've had to that's just had to be our focus. And so we unfortunately haven't been able to, fully fund our actual offering, much less a scholarship program. So that's unfortunate, but I think one of our priorities is cultivating revenue streams,
Yeah.
funds, and other things.
But in terms of like the training programs like CIIS and Naropa and Fluence, like providing scholarships to people who participate in your program and getting it that way.
Oh yeah, there have been several programs like CIS, Naropa, Fluence, Beckley Academy that have been kind enough to offer full or partial scholarships to fireside volunteers. So that's been really great.
Great to hear. Maybe the BPRG can do that too. We'd love to do that.
Well, I'm just going to put one little, if you'd like to stay in touch, I have a little survey link here where you can leave your information and let me know a little bit about what interests you about Fireside, whether it's wanting to learn more about our training or join our newsletter, etc. So feel free to fill that out. It takes less than 1 minute.
Thank you. I have one more question, if that's all right with you, Josh. And it's sort of two-part, actually. You mentioned insurance in passing, and you also mentioned legality, that you couldn't prep people for psychedelics. So I'm curious to learn more about just the nuts and bolts of both legal and insurance around the Fireside Project.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think insurance coverage is one of the most interesting questions in the in the psychedelic field. Because like from an insurance perspective, we're basically a harm reduction service, and we only talk to people after they've consumed psychedelics. It's like I think it's a pretty low risk. And so we didn't have any trouble getting insurance coverage. We also have a very tight container. If everyone receives a disclaimer at the start of their conversation telling them that this is not a substitute for 911 and so forth. And we have a very clear protocol for emergency services. So we take the legal container very seriously. So we didn't have, in trouble with insurance. In terms of the pre-trip conversations, it's not that, in my opinion, a person can't legally have a pre-trip conversation, right? I think a therapist, for example, could, so long as they're not actively promoting illegal conduct, talk to someone about what they're expecting, for instance, going into a psychedelic experience. It's just that when you have a support line that is staffed by 150 volunteers, you just have to have very clear, to use a legal term, bright line rules. And so the no pre-trip conversations is kind of one of those bright line rules. We would, if we were to say, if the rule was for volunteers, you can talk to people before a trip, but only if you don't encourage them to engage in illegal conduct, you could see how that is challenging to apply, would be challenging to apply in practical terms. So we want to be conservative in that sense.
Great. Good. Thank you. And it's so great to have that you've thought through all these issues. I mean, that's a good role model, I think, for other organizations as we deal with these issues. Is there anyone else doing similar work? I know there are other harm reduction groups, but similar to what you're doing.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the Zendo project provides in-person peer support. There are other organizations that do that in Europe, like Cosmicare, and we've done a lot of thinking with, and kind of are in ongoing conversations with the Zendo project and Dance Safe about what is the ideal kind of suite of harm reduction services at a festival look like. And ideally, all of them are integrated, right? The medical tent, Zendo, Fireside, and Dance Safe. But that's just it's a very tricky conversation, right? Because yeah, I mean, there's the rave. I mean, there have been legal disincentives in the past for festivals to allow, you know, what can be considered harm reduction on site, because they're concerned that that is like tacitly encouraging people to take psychedelics. And so you get into these, I think, like really tricky, you know, kind of like legal and you know, insurance and logistical challenges, but I think it's a nut we haven't cracked yet, but it's important given just how many people like go to festivals. But like in our mind, you know, what Zendo does and what Fireside does just are perfectly in harmony with each other, right? Maybe you're leaving the Zendo and you need support the day after the festival. That's perfect for Fireside. Or what if you're at a festival and you don't know where the Zendo project is? You could call Fireside and we could stay on the phone with someone until they actually get to the Zendo. So yeah, we love them. They're amazing. And we are just always looking to deepen our collaboration with them.
Good. That is a great segue to Rick, but I see we have one more question. So, and Rick is with us. He'll be joining us when we're finished. So Jim, you have a question?
No, actually, sorry, other Jim. Go right ahead.
Oh, there are two.
Well, I don't want to take up any time if Rick's ready to go. So maybe we should just do that. Well, let me quickly say, Joshua, I really appreciate what you've been doing, and you know, doing it just right too. It's just amazing. Thank you so much. I'm out here in Oregon, and I think it would have been great if, in addition to facilitator credentials, there were another credential offered in the Oregon Psilocybin Services rules, where there would be another credential for a peer support person, and then there could be like, you know, a minimum number of peer support people for a group taking psychedelics. But that didn't happen. But when someone presented, I'm sorry, I don't remember his name, about the Massachusetts initiative, I know he was talking about having different levels of facilitator support. And it seems like he could fit really well into peer support, could fit into that situation really well. And it just seems like it'd be it'd be a big plus.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. I totally agree. And, you know, I'm a zealot when it comes to peer support. I mean, like, given the number of psychedelic supporters that will be needed in the coming years, therapy just doesn't scale quickly, but peer support can. And therapy though amazing, you know, it is available to a limited number of people. So I think people should have access to multiple forms of support, and I think peer support is definitely one of them.
Thanks.
Good. Well, thank you, Josh. This has been great, and I hope we no, and I hope that we can help you move this really important project along. I'd love to be a volunteer. I'm not sure I can make that commitment, but I'd love to be there.